pumping over $250 billion into the purchase of equity stock in 9 major American banks. In this, the U.S. followed the leads of Britain and the European Union that had adopted similar strategies to protect the solvency of their financial institutions. This was the largest market intervention by government in U.S. history, and it was only the beginning. It framed what appeared as the ignominious final act in the current reign of free market ideology in the United States. It was a deep and bitter irony that in the closing days of the Bush era, the free market ethos that was epitomized in this administration should have failed so spectacularly. For it was a failure and an exposure not only of the particular follies of deregulation and laissez-faire that had led to the crisis, but more profoundly of the political and economic policies that had dominated the Western world for a generation. It was not the validation of free markets that George W. Bush or his admirers would have hoped for. And yet, with news reports in the United States and abroad providing blanket coverage of the crisis, the focus was almost exclusively on the financial collapse, the imminence of global recession, and on the prospects for rescue by governments. Very few questioned the underlying assumptions of the free market system itself. Everyone, regardless of their place on the political spectrum, was quick to affirm their support for the free market. Certainly, this was true in Canada, where the world's least noticed federal election was underway, and predictably, just when Americans had awakened to the folly of free market policies in their own country, Canadians handed a second term to the party most committed to applying these same policies in Canada. The greatest resistance to the bailout plan finally passed by Congress was from Republicans who opposed any government intervention in the market as a slippery slope to socialism. In their minds, and in the minds of many who felt compelled to support the measures, the only options were a choice between an imperiled free market system on the one hand and socialism on the other. Thus, in the very act of announcing the partial nationalization of America's largest banks, President Bush felt compelled to assert that this was only a temporary measure. The government, he said, had no intention of taking over the free market. These measures, he reassured Americans, are not intended to take over the free market, but to preserve it. American taxpayers, it seemed, were to bear the cost of the bank bailout, but must not expect to profit from it. Once the banks returned to profitability, control would revert to them. The taxpayers also ended up covering losses for American International Group, AIG, the world's largest insurer. The rationale was embedded in a follow-up announcement by U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, who stated, "The government owning a stake in any private enterprise is objectionable to most Americans, myself included." The strain on Paulson's face as he had to make this announcement showed how much the decision had cost him. Henry Paulson, free market warrior, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, had stared into the abyss and concluded that his beloved free market was teetering on the verge of collapse. 3 weeks later, as the extent of the cataclysm became clear, with the plunge of stock markets the world over, Alan Greenspan appeared before the House Financial Services Committee to concede that, indeed, he had perceived a flaw in his ideology. He could not have believed, he said, that the self-interest of American banks would not prompt them to better protect their stockholders. It was a rare admission of error that put into question his entire approach to the management of the American economy as a test lab for free market ideology. Over the course of this entire period, no one pointed out that the choice between a hypothetical free market on the one hand and a demonic socialism on the other was always a false choice, or that the failure to understand that free markets were not incompatible with a governmental role in the marketplace was the very mistake that had led to the crisis in the first place. It was the unceasing pressure to deregulate financial markets and repeal the safeguards designed to prevent a recurrence of the stock market crash of 1929 that led to the unrestricted speculation on unsecured, high-risk loans that pulled the floor from under the American financial system. Even now, with the free market model in crisis, and with governments being called upon to intervene in ways not seen since the days of the Great Depression, the question that was uppermost in the minds of policymakers and politicians was how to save this free market system, not how to change it. Of course, it would have been sheer starry-eyed delirium to expect that politicians or the media should notice that among the only institutions to weather the storm were the cooperatives and credit unions that functioned